The timestamp on the palace server read 14:03 Greenwich Mean Time. That was the precise second the press office hit send, releasing a statement that had been drafted, reviewed, and legally vetted over 72 hours of closed-door deliberation. The language was surgically precise, stripped of any emotional residue, reading more like a corporate termination clause than a royal decree. It cited the sovereign's constitutional authority to regulate royal dignities, noted the couple's permanent departure from official duties, and confirmed that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles would be revoked with immediate effect. No room for interpretation, no footnote suggesting a path back, just a cold, bureaucratic finality that reduced 2 decades of royal history to a single paragraph of administrative action. Within 60 seconds, the notification landed on the BBC breaking news ticker, then Sky, then every major global outlet that maintains a permanent alert for palace announcements. The machine was flawless in its efficiency. Editors scrambled, presenters adjusted their scripts, and the world began absorbing a verdict that had been sealed long before the public ever saw the words. But the machine had one glitch, one oversight. Harry and Meghan were not given advance warning. No private call from the king, no quiet heads up from a sympathetic aide, just the same vibrating push notification that buzzed on the phones of millions of strangers, lighting up their kitchen counters while they sat in the California morning, unaware that their entire public identity was being erased by a server in London. Harry reached for his device, glanced at the screen, and read the headline before the coffee in his other hand had time to cool. The palace had prepared the statement 3 days earlier. The only person who didn't know it was coming was the man it was about to destroy. The title carried weight that few outside the institution fully understood. A Duke of Sussex was not merely a fancy label attached to a wedding certificate or a convenient way to introduce a couple at charity galas. It was a legally registered royal dignity, a formal status granted through the Crown's letters patent, documents that carry the force of constitutional law and bind the bearer to the sovereign's authority in perpetuity, or so the public assumed. What the palace's secret legal review team uncovered, however, was a clause buried deep within the original grant, one that had never been tested in the modern era. The titles were bestowed for life, yes, but conditional upon active service to the crown. That condition was the key. Once the recipient permanently withdrew from official duties, the sovereign retained the right to revoke the dignity entirely. Charles's legal counsel spent 48 hours dissecting every precedent, every historical revocation, and every possible challenge that could arise from the couple's legal team. They examined the 1917 letters patent, the 1937 Regency Act, and every legal opinion issued since the late Queen's accession. Their conclusion was unanimous, and it was ruthless. If you do not serve the crown cannot serve you. That cold logic became the foundation of the king's final justification. A leaked internal memo, surfaced to the press hours after the announcement, quoted Charles directly. He argued that allowing the titles to remain would create a dangerous constitutional anomaly, a precedent where royal status existed without royal responsibility. It would invite future members to exploit the crown's prestige while rejecting its duties. The king was not punishing his son, the memo insisted. He was closing a legal loophole that threatened the integrity of the monarchy itself. But the legal file contained one final page that Charles ordered sealed, a page that named the one person who had pushed for this outcome the hardest. The public assumed they understood the architecture of this decision. They pictured Prince William, cold and calculating, pushing the final document across his father's desk with the satisfaction of a brother finally settling an old score. That assumption was understandable, given the years of leaked briefings and carefully planted stories that painted the heir as the driving force behind every royal punishment. But the truth inside the palace walls was far more complicated and far more unsettling. William was not in the room when the final authorization was signed. He was not even consulted on the specific timing of the announcement. The true architects of Harry's removal sat in a different chamber entirely, their names unfamiliar to the tabloid readers who devoured every detail of the Sussex saga. Sir Edward Young, the late Queen's private secretary, had spent decades protecting the institution from threats both external and internal. He had watched the Sussex departure unfold with growing alarm, not because of the family drama, but because of the constitutional precedent it threatened to establish. Alongside the royal household's most senior legal counsel, Young assembled a dossier that left Charles with nowhere to hide. The meeting took place in a smaller study, away from the grandeur of the throne room. No cameras, no courtiers hovering at the edges, just the king, his most trusted advisors, and a single document that reduced his son's future to a binary choice. Protect your son or protect the institution. You cannot do both. The legal team laid out their argument with clinical precision. Every month that passed with the Sussex titles intact created another layer of precedent that future monarchs would struggle to undo. If Harry could walk away and keep the title, why couldn't the next renegade royal do the same? defame. The crown would bleed authority with every departure. Charles listened in silence, his hands resting flat against the oak table. He asked only one question. Was there no middle ground, no compromise that could save the boy while satisfying the crown? The answer came without hesitation. There was not. Charles dismissed his advisors and sat alone with the document for nearly an hour. When he finally signed it, his hand did not tremble. He had chosen the institution, but he had made that choice alone, without William's pressure, without Anne's cold pragmatism, without any brotherly vendetta to blame. Harry would never know that. He would blame William until the day the door finally closed between them, and Charles would never correct him. The king understood something his son did not. Sometimes protecting the people you love means letting them believe you are the villain. The document was sealed, the decision was irreversible, and the one person who could have changed the story walked out of that study carrying the weight of a choice he would never fully explain. 6 months passed. The world moved forward, as it always does, but the erasure continued in quiet, bureaucratic increments that most observers never noticed. Official documents no longer referred to Harry as prince. The title had been stripped from his military records, his charitable affiliations, and the internal files that tracked his movements for security purposes. His name appeared on forms and contracts with the stark simplicity of a private citizen, the royal designation fading like a watermark slowly washed from paper. Archie and Lilibet's birth certificates, once bearing the Sussex surname with quiet pride, were quietly amended by palace administrators who cited administrative realignment as their justification. The children would grow up with a different legal identity than the one their parents had chosen for them, a decision made in a room they had never entered by people they would never meet. Harry stood at the podium of a business conference in New York, adjusting the microphone with hands that had once carried the weight of royal protocol. He introduced himself as Harry Wales, the name he had carried through military service, the name that predated the title, the name that now felt like a relic of a life he had outgrown. The audience applauded politely, unaware that each syllable of that introduction scraped against something raw inside him. He smiled, delivered his remarks, and stepped off the stage to a silence that no amount of applause could fill. Across the ocean, Charles sat alone in his study, the evening light casting long shadows across the desk that had once belonged to his mother. His eyes rested on a framed photograph from Harry's wedding day, the smile still frozen in time, the hope still visible in the way they leaned toward each other. In California, Harry sat in his own study, his own frame holding the same image, the same smiles, the same hope. Neither man reached for the phone. Neither man knew what words could bridge the distance that decisions had carved between them. The crown won, the family lost, and in the silent space between a king and his son, there is no legal appeal for grief.